I'm standing in what used to be Dr. Valerie Crowhust's Pride and Joy front lawn in Silvercrest Bluffs, Colorado, though right now it looks less like a luxury neighborhood and more like a discount Venice. Watching her wade through waist-deep brown water in a $2,000 blazer that's sagging like wet cardboard, screaming at a Channel 7 camera while her white Lucent e-drive sedan floats past the mailbox like the world's most self-important bathtub toy. The smell is something out of a horror movie. Diesel from the emergency generators, rotten grass ripped out by the roots, and that unmistakable tang of backed-up sewer lines, the scent you get when nature walks in, kicks off its boots, and says, "All right, I'm in charge now." Crumpled in Valerie's perfectly manicured hand is that same soggy, red-stamped notice she taped to my cabin door 2 days ago, the one demanding $50,000 or immediate forfeiture of the land my family has owned since the 1960s. The land where my wife's ashes rest under the surface of what she called an unauthorized water hoarding structure. She really said that. About my grandfather's spring-fed pond, the one that just spent 6 decades preventing exactly this flood. My name is Grant Breaker Holloway, and I spent 22 years designing flood control systems with the Army Corps of Engineers, which means I've watched rivers eat billion-dollar projects for breakfast and seen entire cities depend on whether someone got the math right on a Tuesday in 1987. So when some HOA president tells me I'm stealing water from her designer cul-de-sac, I don't get intimidated. I get curious, and then I get real dangerous. 2 years before all of this, when my wife Elena lost her battle with cancer, I moved back to my grandfather's 3 acres on the edge of Timberline Ridge, a cabin, a workshop, and a pond he carved into the mountain like a love letter to common sense. Grandpa Louis Holloway wasn't an engineer on paper, but if you'd seen the way he harnessed that natural spring, channeling it into a retention basin, shaping the spillway with hand-stacked stone, letting water breathe and slow before sending it downstream, you'd understand why the valley below hadn't flooded since Lyndon B. Johnson was in office. Elena loved that pond. Every anniversary we'd throw wildflowers across the surface and watch them drift, and when she died, I took her ashes down there at sunrise, that October light catching the mist rising off the water, and I whispered goodbye into the ripples. So, when Dr. Valerie Crowhust, president of the Silvercrest Bluffs Property Council, their fancy name for an HOA with a god complex, rolled up our gravel drive in her spotless SUV, doused in perfume strong enough to disinfect an airport, I was not really in the mood for her TED Talk on community aesthetics. "Mr. Holloway," she said, giving me a handshake that felt like shaking a prosthetic, "we have a serious issue with your unauthorized water retention," as if I'd installed an illegal dam out of spite, instead of inheriting a 60-year-old flood control system. When she said that these new water management standards were passed while I was indisposed, her polite word for me burying my wife, I felt my jaw clench so tight I could hear my molars complaining. I told her, quietly, that the pond had been here since 1964, long before Silvercrest Bluffs or her laminated rules existed. She told me, even quieter, that history doesn't override policy. And right there, with pine needles crunching under her stilettos and the smell of mountain air fighting her cloud of jasmine, the war over my pond began. 3 days later, she returned with backup, like a low-budget villain bringing her own side character. Behind her SUV wheezed an ancient hatchback, and out climbed Noah Crowhust, her nephew and supposedly certified water usage inspector, which I guess is what you call someone you gave a clipboard to. He was maybe 25, wearing a polo 2 sizes too big, carrying one of those laminated ID badges you can print at home if you own a color printer, and a lack of shame. "Certified by who?" I asked, watching him unpack a yardstick and a tape measure from a hardware store bag. "The, Colorado Water Compliance Bureau," he stammered, reading his own badge like it was news to him. I'd worked with real state and federal water inspectors. They don't show up in personal cars with mismatched hubcaps. They don't measure depth with something you'd use to check if a kid grew an inch over summer. And they definitely don't flinch when you say, "Mind if I call the Bureau to verify your license number?" His face drained like someone pulled the plug. "That won't be necessary," he squeaked, which, unfortunately for him, is not how regulation works. For an hour, I watched this kid perform his one-man show, taking dramatic photos of the pond, squinting at the surface like he expected to see toxic waste glowing, scribbling nonsense, while Valerie hovered behind him like a stage mom coaching her star. Finally, he straightened up, cleared his throat, and declared my pond non-compliant, which is HOA language for "we want it gone." That same afternoon, a red ink notice appeared on my door. $5,000 fine for unauthorized water hoarding from Community Resources. The next morning, the Timberline Ridge Gazette ran a story with the headline, "Local Recluse Hoards Water While Neighbors Face Drought." Nice, right? They'd snapped a photo of the pond from the ugliest possible angle, muddy bank in foreground, no context, just enough to make it look like a swamp instead of the crystal spring it is. Anonymous quotes claimed I was creating a health hazard, ignoring reasonable community standards, and refusing to comply with basic safety expectations. I read the whole thing with my coffee turning to acid in my throat. Then I did what any sane, grieving, tired engineer would do. I went to the courthouse. Down in the archive basement, where the air smells like dust and forgotten wars, I dug through ancient files until I found it. My grandfather's original deed for the property. And there it was. Perpetual spring and water rights, recorded 1964, predating the HOA, the development, the entire subdivision. The water didn't belong to the community. It legally belonged to my family. I called my friend Thomas Brannigan, a former Corps guy turned environmental lawyer, a man whose favorite hobby is beating corrupt officials to death with paperwork. "Breaker," he said after skimming the deed. "This isn't just good. This is kryptonite. They can't touch your water rights. At all." Then his voice dropped. But I dug deeper. Malcolm Crowhurst, Valerie's husband, he runs High Ridge Development Group, and they've been quietly filing permits for a new luxury complex called Crestview Springs, with a decorative water feature fed by, wait for it, your spring. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stared at the pond through my window, feeling a kind of cold anger crawl up my spine. This wasn't about mosquitoes. This was about money. While Thomas worked the legal angles, we brought in Dr. Amelia Kent, a hydrologist from Colorado State, who arrived with real equipment, sampling bottles, digital testers, the works. She tested the pond 6 ways from Sunday and finally looked up at me with a half smile. "Grant," she said, "this water is cleaner than half the bottle brands in the grocery store. Whoever wrote that contamination report is either incompetent or lying." Spoiler, it was lying. Meanwhile, the trail cameras I'd hidden around the property caught something straight out of a bad crime show. Noah sneaking in at 2:17 a.m. with a bucket, dumping dead fish into the pond, taking evidence photos like he was auditioning for Corrupt Inspector of the Year. Another camera caught Senator Malcolm himself pacing the ridge with 2 construction guys, pointing at property lines and muttering about post-acquisition grading and water feature routing. They weren't even pretending it wasn't about development anymore. I called a meeting in my kitchen around Elena's old oak table. Frank and Lydia Turner, who'd been here since the 80s. Harold and June Hollowbrook, their hands shaking as they unfolded their own violation notices. And old Pete Carver, who looked like the mountain itself had grown a beard and learned to swear. One by one, they admitted they'd all been hit with strange fines in the last year. Chicken coops suddenly illegal, vegetable gardens called unapproved landscaping, long-standing sheds suddenly unsafe structures. Every long-time resident, not a single brand-new homeowner. "So it's not just me," I said, spreading the photos and documents across the table like a warm map. "They're clearing the board." We formed the Timberline Heritage Alliance right then. Frank as president, Lydia as secretary, me as the guy who speaks fluent bureaucrat and knows where the bodies are buried in the flood maps. Thomas filed countersuits for harassment, defamation, civil rights violations, and demanded a forensic audit of Silvercrest Bluffs Property Council finances. Dr. Kent wrote a formal environmental report that would make a judge sit up straight. Retired Police Chief Samuel Hardwick started tracing payments, finding suspicious transfers from High Ridge Development to a county health inspector and a couple of city officials who suddenly loved emergency ordinances. Valerie responded with psychological warfare. Anonymous letters accusing me of being unstable, whispers about my PTSD, utility shutoffs that lasted just long enough to make life miserable, rent-a-cops parking near my driveway taking notes like they were watching a zoo animal who owed them money. Still, I stayed patient. Because I knew 2 things. Water always keeps the receipts. There was a storm coming. on the radar and in the courtroom. And then, one gray morning that tasted like cold metal, Deputy Martinez drove up my path, patrol lights spinning quietly behind 3 massive pump trucks. He looked miserable. "Grant, I've got an emergency health order, signed by Judge Henley," he said, eyes apologizing even as his mouth read the words. "They're here to drain the pond under court supervision. You're required to stay back for safety." Behind him, Valerie was almost glowing. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd just erased 60 years of engineering with a signature and a smile. She didn't understand she'd just pulled the plug on her own safety net. They drained my grandfather's pond down to mud, engines roaring, hoses thrashing. The water that had quietly served this valley for decades rushed away in a matter of hours, and I stood there watching, not because I couldn't stop it, but because I needed every second on record. That night, after the trucks left and the stars blinked cold and sharp over the empty basin, I made a phone call. Major Patricia Hayes, Army Corps of Engineers, Regional Office, came the voice on the line. "Ma'am," I said, sliding into an old habit. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Grant Holloway, retired. I'm reporting unauthorized interference with federally recognized flood control infrastructure tied to the South Fork watershed." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to feel heavy. "Understood, Colonel," she finally said, voice suddenly clipped. "All business. We'll have investigators and legal on this immediately. No one touches core integrated retention systems without consequences." Meanwhile, Mira Dalton, the investigative journalist Thomas had looped in, was turning our entire mess into a series of articles and posts. Widowed veteran versus HOA. Spring pond or scapegoat. Who really owns Silvercrest water? By the time the town hall meeting rolled around 3 days later, the sky over Timberline Ridge was an angry bruise, the kind of cloud cover that makes old farmers mutter and engineers check flood models twice. The community center overflowed. Neighbors, reporters, council members, people who'd never looked twice at my property, now very interested in the fact that the valley's only natural retention system had been removed right before the biggest storm in 10 years. I stepped up to the microphone with one manila folder and way too many late nights under my eyes. 3 days ago," I said, as the first fat drops of rain pelted the roof, "on the orders of Dr. Valerie Crowhust and the Silvercrest Bluffs Property Council, my grandfather's spring pond was drained as a public hazard. Tonight, I'm going to show you what it actually was." Slide after slide. Old Corps surveys labeling the pond as a functional retention basin. Hydrology models showing storm flows with and without it. The original HOA charter naming my property as designated community flood protection. Then came the fun part. Security footage of NOAA dumping fish into clean water. Bank records linking High Ridge development to a corrupt inspector. Blueprints for Crestview Springs, with a gleaming central spring feature labeled with the exact spring coordinates of my land. Valerie shot to her feet, face blotchy, yelling that this was slander, that I was twisting facts, that I was endangering the community. Right then, the lights flickered. Emergency radios crackled. Deputy Martinez burst in, soaked, breathing hard. "Storm drains are backing up in Lower Silvercrest," he shouted. "We've got water coming into basements, fast." Everyone rushed to the windows. Streetlights reflected off rushing water, turning their precious cul-de-sacs into temporary rivers. And, like a cherry on top of poetic justice, Valerie's white Lucent sedan floated by the front steps, nudged along by runoff the pond would have quietly swallowed. I didn't raise my voice, didn't gloat, didn't need to. "I told you my pond wasn't hoarding water from the community," I said. "It was holding it for the community." And right then, as if the universe liked good timing, 2 agents in jackets labeled FBI walked in, followed by a Corps officer with a folder thick as a brick. They went straight to Malcolm and Valerie. Conspiracy, mail fraud, interference with federal flood infrastructure, bribery, civil rights violations. The works. The storm passed by morning, leaving damage but not devastation, because even drained, the land still remembered how to absorb what it could. Within 48 hours, the Silvercrest Bluffs Property Council was frozen by court order, High Ridge's permits suspended, and state investigators were crawling over their books like ants on dropped candy. What happened after is what makes the whole nightmare worth telling. Neighbors who'd believed the headlines came over with buckets and apology casseroles. Frank organized sandbag crews and cleanup teams. Lydia started a fund for families whose basements got hit the worst. Even the new folks, the yoga deck and craft beer crowd, rolled up their sleeves and got muddy. Together, we rebuilt the pond, this time with core oversight, community input, and more educational signage than a national park. We renamed it the Elena Holloway Memorial Basin, and with settlement money from the lawsuits, we founded the Holloway Environmental Scholarship for students studying water management and environmental law. Dr. Valerie Crowhurst got 18 months in federal prison and a permanent ban from serving on any association board. Senator Malcolm Crowhurst lost his seat, his company, and 3 years of his life to a federal facility with no golf course. Noah cooperated, testified, and ended up doing community service cleaning actual drainage systems, which I like to think of as redemption via shovel. And me? Most evenings you'll find me sitting by the restored pond, listening to water trickle over my grandfather's stones, Rex curled at my feet, kids laughing on the path nearby, the air smelling like pine and wet earth and second chances. Sometimes I talk to Elena out loud, telling her how the valley finally understood what her favorite place was really doing for them. Sometimes I just sit in the quiet, knowing that, for once, the good guys didn't just survive, they actually won. So let me ask you this. When people in power twist rules, weaponize fear, and hide greed behind community standards, what does real justice look like to you? Just prison time, public humiliation, making them fix the damage they caused, or something harsher or kinder than all of that?